Margaret Campbell, born Margaret Weham in 1912, enters the world as the ultimate product of industrial wealth and social ambition. Her father, George Weham, has transformed his textile empire into a fortune that rivals European aristocracy, and Margaret becomes his living masterpiece, a beautiful, perfectly groomed heiress designed to conquer high society. From her childhood and palatial estates to her legendary debutante season, Margaret's life unfolds as a carefully choreographed performance where appearance matters more than substance. The chapter establishes the fundamental paradox of her existence, possessing everything material yet feeling profoundly empty, surrounded by luxury but starved of genuine human connection. Her stunning beauty becomes both her greatest asset and her most dangerous weapon, teaching her that admiration from others is the only thing that makes her feel real. The narrative hints at the fragility beneath the perfect surface, the growing addiction to attention and validation that will eventually consume her. Set against the backdrop of 1930s London high society, the chapter creates an atmosphere of opulent decay, where wealth insulates but does not protect, and where the very privileges that elevate Margaret also begin to corrupt her understanding of love, worth, and human relationships. December 3rd, 1912, Sunday, Newton Mearns, Scotland. The Weham estate sprawled across the Scottish countryside like a monument to industrial ambition made manifest in stone and manicured gardens. Inside the master bedroom, Margaret Helen Weham entered the world with a cry that echoed through marble corridors, announcing the arrival of an heiress whose life would become synonymous with scandal, beauty, and ultimate destruction. Her father, George Hay Weham, stood at his study window, watching December rain streak the glass, a tumbler of whiskey untouched in his weathered hands. He had built an empire from nothing, textiles, shipping, property, transforming himself from modest beginnings into one of Britain's wealthiest industrialists. Now he had an heir, though not the son he had envisioned. Still, gazing at the gray Scottish sky, he made a silent vow that his daughter would want for nothing, would have the finest education, the most exquisite clothes, entry into society's highest echelons. Margaret's childhood unfolded like a fairy tale written by someone who had never experienced genuine joy. The nursery was a confection of pink silk and imported French furniture, staffed by 3 nannies who attended to her every whimper. By age 5, she owned a white Shetland pony named Snowdrop and received riding lessons from a former cavalry officer. By 7, she spoke fluent French, tutored by a stern Parisian woman who insisted on perfect pronunciation. By 10, she understood that her beauty was not merely genetic fortune, but a form of currency, perhaps the most valuable she possessed. Her mother, Helen Mann remained a distant figure, more concerned with social obligations than maternal affection. She would sweep into Margaret's room in clouds of Chanel No. 5, inspect her daughter's appearance with clinical precision, offer corrections about posture or elocution, then disappear to another charity luncheon or society gathering. Margaret learned early that love, if it existed at all in her world, was conditional, dependent on beauty, proper behavior, and maintaining the family's pristine reputation. The estate itself became both paradise and prison. She could wander the formal gardens with their geometric precision, explore wild woods where deer grazed in dappled sunlight, or visit the stone folly her grandfather had built to commemorate some forgotten military victory. Yet, she was never truly alone. Servants watched from windows, gardeners nodded respectfully as she passed, governesses tracked her movements with vigilant attention. Privacy remained a luxury even vast wealth could not purchase. At 13, Margaret was dispatched to Miss Wolfe's finishing school in London, an institution dedicated to transforming wealthy girls into perfect society wives. She learned which fork to use for fish, how to enter a room to maximize her appearance's impact, the art of conversation that revealed nothing while seeming utterly charming. She discovered that women of her class were fundamentally ornamental, their purpose to reflect well on husbands, produce heirs, and maintain social order through impeccable behavior and strategic marriages. But Margaret possessed something her classmates lacked, an almost supernatural beauty that caused people to halt mid-sentence when she entered rooms. Her features were perfectly symmetrical, her eyes a startling blue-green that seemed to shift with her moods, her figure the ideal of 1920s femininity. She understood, with precocious clarity that unsettled even her teachers, that this beauty was her ticket to something greater than mere wealth. She could marry into nobility, become a duchess, perhaps even move in royal circles. Her father encouraged these ambitions, seeing in them validation of his own social climbing. He had purchased his way into respectability. His daughter would be born into it through marriage. He increased her allowance to staggering amounts, ensuring she always wore the latest fashions, arrived at social events in the finest automobiles, and sparkled with jewelry that made other girls' adornments appear like costume pieces. Yet something hollow echoed through all this luxury. Margaret would sometimes stand before her mirror, surrounded by more dresses than she could wear in a year, more jewels than she could count, and feel absolutely nothing. The reflection staring back was exquisite, flawless, utterly empty. She was a beautiful shell, perfectly constructed for display, but what lived inside that shell remained mysterious, even to herself. On her 18th birthday, her father threw a ball that dominated society columns for months afterward. 500 guests, an orchestra flown in from Vienna, champagne that cost more per bottle than most families earned annually. Margaret descended the grand staircase in a silver gown requiring 3 fittings and costing enough to feed a village for months. Everyone applauded, everyone stared, everyone wanted proximity to her extraordinary beauty and wealth. She smiled, danced, and played her part perfectly. But as midnight approached and she stood on the terrace overlooking glittering grounds, cold dread settled into her bones. This was her life, this performance, this endless display. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the lights, she sensed something waiting, some consequence that would eventually be demanded for all this unearned magnificence. Chapter 2. The Rise and the Initial Struggles. Margaret's early 20s become a calculated campaign to secure the most advantageous marriage possible, leading her to Charles Sweeney, an American golf champion whose charm masks serious financial instability. Their whirlwind romance and lavish 1933 wedding seemed to confirm Margaret's ascension to international society's pinnacle, but cracks appear almost immediately. Sweeney's gambling debts, chronic infidelities, and inability to match Margaret's social ambitions create escalating tensions she initially refuses to acknowledge. She throws herself into being the perfect society wife, hosting legendary parties, gracing fashion magazines, cultivating relationships with aristocrats and celebrities. Yet the emptiness she felt as a girl deepens into something more dangerous, a desperate need for validation through conquest, both social and romantic. A devastating elevator accident leaves her physically broken and psychologically transformed, emerging harder and more reckless. Her marriage becomes pure performance, her life a series of staged photographs hiding increasing unhappiness. The chapter reveals her growing awareness that beauty and wealth, rather than solving her problems, have merely created more sophisticated ones. As her first marriage crumbles, Margaret sets her sights on an even more ambitious target, genuine aristocratic status, through marriage to Margaret Campbell, the Duke of Argyll, whose title and charm mask his own desperate financial needs. March 11, 1933, Saturday. Brompton Oratory, London. The wedding was spectacle incarnate, making even the most jaded society columnists reach for superlatives. Margaret, now 21, walked down the aisle in white satin and Brussels lace requiring 6 seamstresses working 3 months. 800 guests filled the pews, craning necks for better views. Outside, crowds of ordinary Londoners pressed against police barriers, hoping to glimpse the bride who had become famous simply for being beautiful and rich. Charles Sweeney waited at the altar, devastatingly handsome in his morning coat, American confidence evident in his easy smile. He was a golf champion moving in international circles with casual grace of someone born to privilege, though his wealth was more reputation than reality. Margaret had met him at a Mayfair party 6 months earlier, and his pursuit had been relentless, flattering, intoxicating. He made her laugh, something she had rarely done in her carefully controlled childhood. He treated her beauty as something to celebrate rather than merely display, promising a life beyond British society's stifling conventions. What she did not know, what she chose not to investigate too closely, was that Charles's fortune was largely borrowed, his lifestyle maintained through credit and charm rather than actual wealth. Her father harbored reservations, but Margaret was determined. This marriage represented her declaration of independence, her choice, her future. The first year passed in a blur of transatlantic crossings and society pages. They rented a Mayfair mansion, its rooms filled with flowers replaced daily, cellars stocked with vintage champagne. Margaret threw parties that became legendary, intimate dinners for 30, weekend house parties lasting weeks, charity balls raising enormous sums while costing even more to stage. She appeared in Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, every society column worth reading, always perfectly dressed, always smiling, always embodying sophisticated glamour. But bills accumulated faster than Charles could pay them. His golf winnings were sporadic. Business ventures had tendencies to collapse, just as they seemed promising. He began borrowing from Margaret's accounts, always promising repayment, always with new schemes that would solve everything. She ignored warning signs, too invested in their projected image to acknowledge the rot underneath. Then came the first confirmed infidelity. Margaret was at their Surrey country house when she received an anonymous letter, typed on expensive stationery, detailing Charles's affair with a French actress in Cannes. The letter included dates, locations, descriptions specific enough to be undeniably true. She sat in her morning room, surrounded by fresh peonies and 18th-century furniture, holding this paper, threatening to destroy her carefully constructed narrative. Her first instinct was not anger, but calculation. Divorce was scandalous, especially for a woman of her position. It would mean admitting failure, acknowledging flawed judgment, that her beauty was insufficient to hold a man's attention. She decided to ignore it, to pretend she had never received the letter, to double down on being the perfect wife. She threw herself into self-improvement with intensity once applied to securing a husband. She consulted London's most expensive beauticians, underwent treatments promising to maintain her flawless complexion, controlled her diet with obsessive precision. She studied fashion magazines like sacred texts, ensuring she remained ahead of trends, always the most stylish woman in any room. But Charles's infidelities continued, each more brazen than the last. He no longer bothered hiding them, perhaps sensing Margaret would never confront him, would never risk divorce scandal. Their marriage became a business arrangement, a social partnership where they appeared together at important events, smiled for photographers, then retreated to separate bedrooms and separate lives. In 1934, Margaret suffered a horrific accident that would fundamentally change her. While staying at a London hotel, she fell down an elevator shaft, sustaining severe injuries including a broken back. The physical pain was excruciating, but the psychological impact was even more profound. During her long recovery, dependent on painkillers and confined to bed for months, something hardened inside her. She emerged from the experience with a new recklessness, a sense that life was fragile and should be seized without regard for consequences. Margaret began her own affairs, though she was more discreet than Charles, more strategic. She chose men who could advance her socially, minor royals, wealthy industrialists, titled aristocrats. These relationships were transactions, exchanges of beauty for access, of intimacy for social capital. She felt nothing during them, or rather felt a hollow triumph, a sense of winning at some game whose rules she had never fully understood. Her father watched this deterioration with growing concern. During a visit to Scotland, he confronted her in his study, the same room where he had stood when she was born. "You're destroying yourself," he said quietly, his industrial empire now worth millions, but unable to protect his daughter from her own choices. "This marriage is making you into someone I don't recognize." Margaret looked at him with eyes that had lost their youthful brightness. "I'm exactly who you made me to be," she replied. "Beautiful, wealthy, socially successful. Isn't that what you wanted? Isn't that what all this was for?" By 1947, her marriage to Charles was effectively over, though they maintained appearances. The divorce proceedings revealed debts that shocked even Margaret's father. Charles had spent her money with the same careless abandon he had spent his own non-existent fortune, leaving her financially diminished and emotionally exhausted. But Margaret had learned something valuable from this first marriage, that beauty and wealth, while powerful, were not enough. She needed more. She needed a title, real aristocratic status, the kind of position that could not be bought but only acquired through marriage to the right man, and she knew exactly who that man should be. Chapter 3. The Major Setback or Crisis. Margaret's marriage to Ian Campbell, the 11th Duke of Argyll, in 1951, seems to fulfill all her ambitions: a genuine aristocratic title, a historic castle, entry into the highest levels of British society. But the marriage is doomed from the start. The Duke, though titled and charming, is deeply in debt, psychologically unstable, and increasingly paranoid about Margaret's past and present behavior. Their relationship becomes a battlefield of accusations, with infidelities flying in both directions. Margaret's affairs, both real and rumored, become fodder for society gossip, while the Duke's obsessive jealousy drives him to extreme measures. He hires private investigators, intercepts her mail, and eventually orchestrates a break-in at her London apartment. The crisis reaches its peak when he discovers the evidence that will destroy her: explicit Polaroid photographs of Margaret with unidentified men, including the infamous headless man image. The chapter builds toward the devastating moment when the Duke confronts her with this evidence, setting in motion the divorce proceedings that will become the scandal of the decade. The tone shifts from glamorous to gothic as their Scottish castle becomes a prison and their marriage transforms into a psychological horror story of mutual destruction and vindictive cruelty. March 22, 1951, Thursday. Caxton Hall, London. Margaret's second wedding was more subdued than her first, but infinitely more significant. She was now 38, still extraordinarily beautiful but with a hardness around her eyes that photographs could not quite conceal. Ian Douglas Campbell, 11th Duke of Argyll, was 51, tall and distinguished, with the kind of aristocratic bearing that came from centuries of breeding rather than mere wealth. He represented everything Margaret had been pursuing since her divorce from Charles: genuine nobility, a historic title, a castle that had stood for 800 years. Inverary Castle, the Duke's ancestral seat in the Scottish Highlands, was magnificent and crumbling in equal measure. Its turrets rose against grey skies, its rooms filled with priceless tapestries and furniture that had witnessed centuries of Campbell history. But the roof leaked, the heating system was medieval, and the maintenance costs were staggering. The Duke needed Margaret's money as desperately as she needed his title. It was a transaction, though both preferred to dress it in the language of love. The first months were almost happy. Margaret threw herself into restoring the castle, spending enormous sums on repairs and renovations. She hired London's best decorators, imported furniture from Paris, filled rooms with flowers and fine wines. She hosted weekend parties that drew aristocrats and celebrities from across Europe, transforming the drafty old castle into a center of glamorous society life. She was finally a duchess, finally occupying the social position she had been groomed for since childhood. But the Duke was not Charles Sweeney. He was older, more traditional, deeply invested in the dignity of his ancient title. He expected Margaret to behave as a duchess should, with decorum, discretion, proper deference to his position. He did not appreciate her flamboyant entertaining, her modern fashions, her easy familiarity with celebrities and commoners alike. He wanted a wife who would preserve the Campbell legacy, not one who treated his castle like a stage set for her own social ambitions. Their arguments began over small things: her spending, her parties, her refusal to adopt the more conservative style he preferred. But they quickly escalated into something darker. The Duke had heard rumors about Margaret's past, whispered stories of affairs and indiscretions during her first marriage and in the years between. He began questioning her, demanding details, accusing her of bringing shame to his ancient name. Margaret discovered that her husband was not the stable aristocrat he had appeared to be. He suffered from what today would be recognized as severe anxiety and paranoid tendencies, conditions exacerbated by financial stress and his obsessive concern with family honor. He would fly into rages over perceived slights, then retreat into cold silence for days. He began monitoring her movements, questioning servants about her activities, opening her mail. In 1953, Margaret made a decision that would ultimately destroy her. She began an affair with Duncan Sandys, a conservative politician and Winston Churchill's son-in-law. It was reckless, given her husband's paranoia, but Margaret seemed unable to stop herself. The affair was passionate, conducted in London hotels and borrowed apartments, documented in love letters that mixed political gossip with explicit sexual content. The Duke hired private investigators, men who followed Margaret through London, photographed her entering and leaving buildings, compiled reports on her activities. He became convinced that she was having multiple affairs, that she was making him a laughingstock among his aristocratic peers. His paranoia was not entirely unjustified. Margaret had indeed had several relationships since their marriage, though whether they constituted full affairs or merely flirtations remained ambiguous. Margaret, for her part, had begun keeping souvenirs of her liaisons. In an act of reckless vanity, she had started taking Polaroid photographs, a relatively new technology that allowed for instant private images that could not be developed by commercial laboratories. These photographs were explicit, showing her in various states of undress with men whose faces were carefully cropped out of frame. She kept them locked in her London apartment, perhaps as insurance, perhaps as trophies, perhaps simply as proof that she was still desirable. Then, in 1959, the Duke's investigators orchestrated a break-in at Margaret's London residence while she was visiting New York. They searched systematically, looking for evidence of infidelity that could be used in divorce proceedings. In a locked drawer in her dressing table, they found photographs that exceeded even the Duke's worst suspicions. The images showed Margaret wearing nothing but her signature 3-strand pearl necklace, engaged in sexual acts with men whose identities were obscured. The most infamous photograph would later be known as the headless man image, showing Margaret performing oral sex on a man whose face was cropped out of the frame. The photographs were explicit, undeniable, devastating. The Duke confronted her at Inverarray upon her return from America. His hands shaking with rage and humiliation, he threw the photographs across the dining room table where they had once entertained royalty. "Who are they?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "How many men? How long have you been making a fool of me?" Margaret looked at the photographs scattered across antique mahogany, her naked body exposed in harsh Polaroid light, her most private moments transformed into evidence of her moral corruption. She had forgotten about them, souvenirs from affairs she barely remembered, kept out of vanity or perhaps as insurance against future loneliness. "It doesn't matter who they are," she said finally, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "You've been looking for a reason to divorce me since the day we married. Now you have one." But the Duke wanted more than divorce. He wanted revenge. He wanted to destroy her reputation so thoroughly that she would never recover, wanted to punish her for every slight, every perceived humiliation, every moment of his paranoid suffering. He decided to make the divorce as public and scandalous as possible, to introduce the photographs as evidence in court, to force Margaret to defend herself against charges of adultery, cruelty, and moral depravity. Margaret's lawyers advised her to settle quietly, to accept whatever terms the Duke offered in exchange for keeping the photographs private. But she refused. She had spent her entire life performing for public approval, maintaining the perfect image, being the beautiful, glamorous Duchess. She would not surrender that image without a fight, even if fighting meant exposing herself to public judgment. The divorce proceedings were scheduled for 1963. In the intervening years, Margaret lived in suspended animation, still technically the Duchess of Argyll, still invited to social events, but aware that a sword hung over her head. The photographs existed, locked in the Duke's safe, waiting to be revealed. The crisis was complete. Her private rebellion had been weaponized against her, and there was no escape. Chapter 4. The Unraveling. The divorce trial begins in 1963, and Margaret finds herself at the center of a media frenzy unlike anything Britain has seen. The Duke's lawyers present the photographs as evidence, describing Margaret as a nymphomaniac and morally depraved woman who brought shame to the ancient Campbell name. Judge Lord Wheatley delivers a devastating judgment, calling Margaret a completely promiscuous woman whose sexual appetite was wholly insatiable. The media gleefully reports every detail, transforming the trial into a national spectacle combining prurient interest with moral condemnation. Margaret attempts to maintain her dignity, appearing in court impeccably dressed, refusing to show shame or remorse. But the psychological toll is immense. Former friends abandon her, social invitations disappear, and she becomes a pariah in the very society she once dominated. The chapter explores the vicious double standard that allows the men in the photographs to remain anonymous while Margaret is publicly destroyed, and examines how her beauty and wealth, once assets, now become evidence of her moral corruption. The unraveling is both public and private as Margaret watches her carefully constructed identity disintegrate. She emerges from the trial as the Dirty Duchess, a cautionary tale about female sexuality and the cruel hypocrisy of British high society. May 7, 1963, Tuesday. Court of Session, Edinburgh. The courtroom was packed with journalists, society figures who had once been Margaret's friends, and members of the public who had queued for hours to witness the spectacle. Margaret entered wearing a tailored suit in powder blue, her hair perfectly coiffed, her makeup flawless. She looked like she was attending a garden party rather than her own public execution. It was a performance, perhaps her finest, and she was determined to give them something to remember. The Duke's lawyer, a severe man named William Milligan, rose to present his case. His voice was cold, clinical, as he described Margaret as a woman of insatiable sexual appetite who had conducted numerous affairs throughout her marriage. He detailed her spending habits, her parties, her refusal to conform to the proper behavior expected of a duchess. But these were merely preliminaries. The real ammunition came when he introduced the photographs. The courtroom fell silent as the images were presented to the judge. They were not displayed publicly. That would have been too scandalous even for this sensational trial, but their existence and content were described in excruciating detail. Judge Lord Wheatley examined them with an expression of barely concealed disgust. Margaret sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her face betraying nothing. She had learned long ago how to maintain composure under scrutiny, how to present a flawless exterior regardless of internal turmoil. The press coverage was immediate and merciless. Newspapers that had once celebrated Margaret's beauty and style now competed to condemn her moral character. The photographs, while not published, were described in language that left little to imagination. The man in the most infamous image became known as the Headless Man, and speculation about his identity consumed the nation. Was it a royal? A politician? A celebrity? The mystery only intensified the scandal. Margaret's lawyers attempted a defense, arguing that the photographs had been stolen, that her private life should remain private, that the Duke's paranoia and financial desperation had driven him to these extreme measures. But the moral climate of 1963 Britain was not sympathetic to a woman who had clearly violated the sexual norms of her class and time. Aristocratic women were expected to be discreet, to maintain appearances even if they strayed. Margaret had been neither discreet nor apologetic. The trial revealed other details that shocked the public. Evidence suggested Margaret had used her beauty and social connections to conduct affairs with multiple men, some married, some in positions of public trust. Names were mentioned in sealed testimony: Duncan Sandys, the Minister of Defense; Douglas Fairbanks, Jr., the American actor; Baron Sigismund von Braun, a German diplomat. The Duke's lawyers painted a picture of a woman who used sex as a weapon, who collected powerful men like trophies, who had no moral compass beyond her own pleasure and social advancement. Margaret took the stand on the trial's 8th day. She was questioned for 6 hours, her every answer scrutinized, her past dissected in humiliating detail. She maintained her composure throughout, admitting to some affairs while denying others, refusing to identify the men in the photographs, insisting that her private life should not be subject to public judgment. But her very beauty, her poise, her refusal to show shame, seemed to work against her. She appeared too controlled, too calculating, confirming the prosecution's portrait of her as a cold manipulator rather than a victim of circumstance. "I have conducted myself during my marriage with His Grace, according to the best of my ability," Margaret testified, her voice steady but strained. "I have tried to be a good wife and a good duchess. If I have failed in some respects, I am only human." But humanity was not what the court wanted to see. They wanted contrition, shame, acknowledgement of moral failure. Margaret's refusal to provide these satisfactions only fueled their condemnation. Lord Wheatley delivered his judgment on March 26, 1963. His words were devastating, a moral condemnation that went far beyond the legal issues at hand. He described Margaret as a completely promiscuous woman whose sexual appetite could only be satisfied by a number of men. He found her guilty of adultery with multiple partners, awarded the Duke his divorce, and ordered Margaret to pay substantial costs. The judgment was read aloud in court, each word a nail in the coffin of her reputation. The media response was explosive. Margaret's face appeared on every front page, usually accompanied by the phrase "the Dirty Duchess," a nickname that would follow her for the rest of her life. The trial had transformed her from a glamorous society figure into a national symbol of moral decay, a cautionary tale about the dangers of female sexuality and aristocratic excess. Conservative politicians cited her case as evidence of declining moral standards. Religious leaders used her as an example in sermons about sin and punishment. Ordinary people discussed her behavior in shops and pubs, most condemning her as a disgrace to her class and gender. The double standard was glaring and brutal. The men in the photographs remained anonymous, protected by both legal procedures and social convention. Their reputations remained intact while Margaret was publicly destroyed. Duncan Sandys, when questioned by journalists, simply refused to comment, and the matter was dropped. The other men never faced any consequences, their identities the subject of speculation, but never confirmed. Only Margaret paid the price for what had clearly been mutual activities. Her father, now elderly and in poor health, read about the trial in his study at the Scottish estate. He had built an empire to give his daughter every advantage, had indulged her every whim, had believed that wealth and beauty would guarantee her happiness. Now he saw the result, his daughter transformed into a public spectacle, her name synonymous with scandal, her reputation destroyed beyond repair. He died 6 months later, some said of a broken heart, though the death certificate listed heart failure. Margaret's social circle evaporated overnight. Invitations stopped arriving. Old friends crossed the street to avoid her. Hostesses who had once competed for her presence at their parties now pretended not to know her. She was toxic, a reminder of uncomfortable truths about aristocratic life that polite society preferred to ignore. The same people who had attended her parties, who had gossiped about her affairs, who had enabled and encouraged her behavior, now condemned her with righteous indignation. The unraveling was complete. Margaret emerged from the courthouse into a world that no longer had a place for her. The performance was over, the mask had fallen, and what remained was a woman stripped of everything that had once defined her: her reputation, her social position, her carefully constructed identity. She was no longer Margaret Campbell, Duchess of Argyll. She was simply the Dirty Duchess, a cautionary tale for the ages. Chapter 5: Resolution and Final Reflection. The final chapter follows Margaret's remaining 30 years, from 1963 until her death in 1993, as she never recovers from the scandal. She spends decades attempting to rehabilitate her reputation through interviews, a memoir, and legal battles, but remains forever branded by the trial. Her beauty fades, her money dwindles through legal costs and extravagant living, and she becomes increasingly isolated and bitter. She moves from luxurious apartments to progressively smaller accommodations, selling possessions to pay bills, watching as the world that once celebrated her forgets she exists. Yet she maintains a defiant dignity, refusing to apologize or show regret, insisting she was a victim of a vindictive husband and hypocritical society. The chapter explores the ultimate cost of a life built on superficial values: beauty, wealth, and social position, and how quickly those assets can disappear. Margaret's story becomes a meditation on aging, female sexuality, and the cruel double standards that destroy women while protecting men. Her death in a nursing home, largely forgotten except as a historical curiosity, provides a tragic endpoint to a life that began with such promise and privilege. The final reflection contemplates the emptiness of a legacy built entirely on image and the human cost of living as a beautiful object rather than a complete person. October 15th, 1975, Wednesday. Mayfair, London. Margaret sat in her apartment, now considerably smaller than the one she had occupied during her glory days, and reviewed the manuscript of her memoir. Forget Not was her attempt to control the narrative, to present her version of events to a public that had long ago made up its mind about her character. The book would be published the following year, and she harbored hopes that it might rehabilitate her reputation, might allow people to see her as a victim rather than a villain. The writing process had been painful, forcing her to revisit the trial, the photographs, the public humiliation, but she had approached it with characteristic determination, refusing to apologize or express regret. She portrayed herself as a woman ahead of her time, punished for sexual freedom that would have been unremarkable in a man, destroyed by a vindictive husband who could not accept her independence. There was truth in this version, but it was also incomplete, omitting her own role in the disaster, her recklessness, her inability to consider consequences. The 12 years since the trial had been a slow, inexorable decline. The divorce settlement had left her with far less than she needed to support her expensive habits. The London apartment, while smaller than her previous residences, was still costly to maintain. She had sold most of her jewelry, many of her designer clothes, furniture that had once filled much larger spaces. What remained was a carefully curated collection of objects that represented her former glory: photographs from her debutante days, invitations to parties at Buckingham Palace, newspaper clippings from when she had been celebrated rather than condemned. She rarely ventured out now. The streets of London, which she had once navigated as a queen among commoners, now felt hostile and unwelcoming. On the rare occasions when she did go to restaurants or shops, she was aware of whispers, of people recognizing her and nudging their companions. She had become a cautionary tale, a ghost from a more scandalous era, someone to be pointed at rather than admired. Her few remaining friends were mostly people who had also fallen from grace, fellow outcasts who understood the cruelty of social exclusion. They would meet for lunch in quiet restaurants, drinking too much wine and reminiscing about better times. These gatherings had a desperate quality, a shared pretense that they were still relevant, still connected to the world that had rejected them. Margaret's relationship with her children from her first marriage was strained. They had been humiliated by the trial, forced to defend their mother against accusations they knew were largely true. As adults, they maintained minimal contact, sending perfunctory birthday cards and making brief, uncomfortable visits. They had their own lives, their own families, and Margaret was a reminder of a past they preferred to forget. The book's publication in 1976 generated brief interest, but did not achieve the redemption she sought. Critics noted her lack of self-awareness, her continued focus on superficial matters, her beauty, her clothes, her social connections, rather than deeper emotional truths. The public, having moved on to newer scandals, was not particularly interested in revisiting the Argyll divorce. Margaret remained the Dirty Duchess, a historical curiosity rather than a sympathetic figure. In 1978, she was forced to move again, this time to an even smaller apartment in a less fashionable area. The move required selling more possessions, each sale a small death. The Louis XV chairs that had furnished her drawing room, the impressionist paintings that had hung in her bedroom, the silver service that had been used at dinner parties attended by royalty, all were auctioned off to pay mounting debts. She kept only the essentials and a few treasured photographs, images of herself at 20, at 30, at the height of her beauty and power. The 1980s brought further decline. Margaret was now in her 70s, her legendary beauty finally fading despite expensive cosmetic procedures and meticulous grooming. The face that had launched 1,000 society columns was now heavily made up, the makeup itself becoming a kind of mask, an attempt to preserve something that could no longer be preserved. She dyed her hair the same shade it had been in her youth, wore the same style of clothes, maintained the same imperious manner. But the effect was no longer glamorous. It was tragic, a refusal to accept the passage of time. She gave occasional interviews to journalists interested in historical scandals, retelling her story with practiced precision. She always insisted she had been wronged, that the trial had been unjust, that the men in the photographs should have been held equally accountable. These interviews would appear in Sunday supplements or women's magazines, usually accompanied by recent photographs that emphasized how much she had aged, how far she had fallen. The articles treated her as a relic, a reminder of a more repressed era when sexual scandal could destroy a woman's life. By 1990, Margaret could no longer afford even her small apartment. She moved into a nursing home in Pimlico, her accommodation paid for by her children, who visited rarely and briefly. The nursing home was comfortable but institutional, a far cry from the palaces and castles she had once inhabited. She had a single room with a narrow bed, a small television, and a window overlooking a car park. On the walls, she hung photographs from her past, herself in a tiara at a royal reception, herself in a ball gown descending a grand staircase, herself young and beautiful and powerful. The other residents knew who she was, or rather, they knew the scandal. Some were sympathetic, others judgmental, but most simply saw an old woman who talked too much about the past. Margaret would sit in the common room, impeccably dressed even in her 90s, and tell stories about parties she had attended, people she had known, a life that seemed increasingly fictional as she described it. She had never remarried after the Duke, never had another serious relationship. The scandal had made her untouchable, and as she aged, she became invisible, no longer desirable or threatening. She had spent her youth and middle age obsessed with her appearance, with maintaining her beauty as a form of power, and now that power had completely evaporated. She was just another old woman, waiting to die. Her mind remained sharp, which was perhaps a curse. She could remember everything, every party, every affair, every moment of triumph and humiliation. She would lie in her narrow bed at night, unable to sleep, and replay her life like a film, trying to identify the moment when everything went wrong. Was it marrying Charles? Marrying the Duke? The affairs? The photographs? Or was it something earlier, something fundamental in how she had been raised, in the values she had absorbed, in the belief that beauty and wealth could substitute for genuine human connection? On July 25, 1993, Sunday, Margaret suffered a stroke. She died in the nursing home, alone except for a nurse she did not recognize. Her children arranged a small funeral, attended by fewer than 20 people. The obituaries were brief, focusing primarily on the scandal, on the photographs, on the trial that had destroyed her. The Dirty Duchess Dies read one headline, unable to resist the alliterative appeal even in death. She was buried in Brookwood Cemetery, in a plot far from the grand family mausoleum where her parents rested. There was no elaborate monument, just a simple headstone with her name and dates. The grave was rarely visited. Within a few years, most people had forgotten she had ever existed, except as a footnote in books about British scandals, a cautionary tale about the dangers of female sexuality and aristocratic excess. But in those final years, in the nursing home, Margaret had occasionally experienced moments of clarity that cut through her carefully maintained self-deceptions. She would look at the photographs on her wall, herself at 18, radiant with promise, herself at 30, at the peak of her beauty and power, and recognize them as images of a stranger, someone she had never really known. She had spent her entire life performing, being what others wanted her to be, using her beauty and wealth as shields against genuine self-knowledge. The tragedy was not the scandal, not the trial, not even the public humiliation. The tragedy was that she had never developed a self beyond the performance, had never discovered who Margaret might have been if she had not been born beautiful and wealthy, if she had not been taught that her value lay in her appearance and social position. She had been a magnificent surface with nothing underneath, a perfect reflection that had never asked what it was reflecting or why. In the end, the photographs that destroyed her were perhaps the most honest images ever taken of her, showing her without artifice, engaged in acts of genuine desire rather than social performance. That they had been used as evidence of her depravity rather than her humanity, and she had spent the rest of her life trying to reconstruct the perfect facade they had shattered, never understanding that the facade itself had been the problem all along.